Welcome to a new episode of Outside the Panels with your host, Johnny the Machine Hughes.
Welcome everyone to another episode of Outside the Panels. I am your host, Johnny the Machine Hughes, and this time around we are so far outside the panels there is barely a panel in sight. You're thinking, what the hell's the machine on about this time? Well, this time around we have a really fantastic guest to talk about his book. The book in question is Batman and Psychology, A Dark, Stormy Night. And therefore, I must be speaking to Dr. Travis Langley.
Oh, that would be me.
Yay! Welcome to the pod. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. You?
Yep, all good. It's a chilly English evening, and I'm talking about Batman with a guy who's done a shed load of work on the character from an observational point of view. Where else would you rather be than right here, right now, right?
What's funny is how often I've heard people say, refer to me as having literally written the book on Batman. And while it is true, it still feels weird hearing it.
Excellent. Okay, so this is the second edition of the book.
Yes.
Why was there a need? Let's start with the big question. Why was there a need for a second edition?
That is a good question. So wrote the book 10 years ago. It came out almost 10 years ago. And during that time, some things have changed. There are a couple of issues that come up more than they used to. In the book, I don't actually, in the first edition, I didn't say a lot about why Batman does not kill. Now, and there's one book since then, in The Joker Psychology, Evil Clowns and the Women Who Love Them. I have a whole chapter on that issue, but it's more about why the Joker doesn't kill Batman. And because of the Ben Affleck films, in particular, people have really gotten to arguing about this issue of should Batman kill? Does Batman kill? Batman doesn't kill. Yes, he does. No, my Batman doesn't kill. And it's an argument that can never end. Because we're talking about a fictional character with many different versions written by all these different individuals over the years. Your Batman is not the same as my Batman. My Batman now is not the same as it was when I was a younger adult, when I was a teen, when I was in elementary school, when I was a kid who one of his earliest words in the baby book says Batman.
So that brings up an interesting question, Doctor. Who is your Batman right now?
Right now, I'm really enjoying reading Batman stories in this Batman Urban Legend series. Of course, they have more to do with characters associated with Batman, but I'm really enjoying getting to see the interactions between him and the other heroes, the Robins, the Batgirls, the Signal, and associated characters. I really love looking at those interactions between these characters that particular series has been offering. In the big picture, who's my Batman? It does kind of depend on when you ask. I think the stories in the 70s that Denny O'Neil and Steve Englehart wrote come closest to what you really think of as the definitive Batman.
Okay, cool, excellent.
And then there's Batman the Animated Series. When in doubt, go with Batman the Animated Series.
Well, people say that, but I've got a controversial thought about that.
What's that? I want to hear this.
Well, so I love Batman the Animated Series. Absolutely think it's the best thing around. However, I have a huge soft spot for the Batman cartoon from 2004 with the Reno Romano voice as Batman and Alfred Duncan as Alfred. The reimaging of some of the characters, the introduction of Chain, the different looks, how Batgirl comes into it before Robin. It's a licensing thing, admittedly, but I just like the aesthetic of it all, and I like his long drapey cape and stuff. Maybe part of it's because I've seen Batman the Animated Series so often.
Yeah.
I always have this grandiose idea that, you know what, I'm going to watch Batman the Animated Series from episode 1, volume 1. I put the first disc in.
So that will be a Man-Bat episode.
The Man-Bat, well, actually over here.
Depending on which collection.
I was going to say, for me, it's Christmas of the Jokers. So
okay.
So you put the first episode, press play, and the menu comes up, and I'm looking down the menu, and I know I'm going to skip the Underdwellers. Yeah, I'm skipping that bad boy. I know later on I'm going to skip the Terrible Trio because the animation style's terrible. Boof, that down. So I start with the best intentions, but obviously, hey ho. It's interesting you bring up urban legends and the association. For me, a lot of the knock, and I suppose you could carry this all the way back to the 60s and the Adam West TV show, the prevailing theory for Batman is that the villains are the more interesting characters than he is. So from what you're saying about urban legends, are you saying that the interactions with Signal and the Robins and Red Hood and everyone else, are they more interesting than just Batman by himself?
Batman does not operate in a vacuum. You need somebody else. With him and the villains, you have a very strong crime-related story. You get less of him as a person. You get more a sense of what he actually is like as a person when he's dealing with some of those that he's working with. Not everybody, plenty of those that he's working with, he's intimidating them. He's the guy who can walk into a room full of people who can fly, read minds, and run faster than light, and they're intimidated by him. There is this extra scary Batman act, which he'll even have around some of his allies, but there is more. Well, like Batman Begins is the film where we get the most sense of Bruce Wayne as a person throughout the movie compared to the previous ones. And well, he's not even Batman for a little bit, and he's honest with Alfred, and even the Henri Ducard, Ra's al Ghul character. There's a great honesty about him. Because the Burton Schumacher films, he's either distant and you don't get a lot of him. You're very shallow with the Schumacher stuff, and with the Burton ones, he's a distant figure. Like the first Burton movie, we're seeing him more through the eyes of other characters because he is mysterious in that film himself. And in the second one, he's feeling distant and cut off from other people. That's why he's not even pretending to be a party at the start of Batman Returns. As Bruce, he's just sitting in the dark waiting for the light to shine and bring himself to life. And so Batman Begins is the one where we really get to see him as a character.
Cool. I have another controversial thought. I think the George Clooney Batman and Robin. I think that's a better movie than The Dark Knight Rises.
Interesting.
I can you can hear my thoughts. I can see you're like, what's he on about? Here's my thought process. Hear me out. The Dark Knight Rises has too many plot holes for it to make any sense whatsoever. And yes, I know it's a comic book character, and yes, I know it's a fictional thing. But when I want to go to the cinema, I want to be immersed in it. All right? I don't want to have to sit there and think, why does this great crime fighter decide to climb out of a pit and then kick a rope down there so all the bad guys can climb out of it?
Why does he go mope for 8 years? Or however long it was. He spends all this time becoming Batman. And then Rachel, with whom we never actually saw him have a relationship with Rachel.
Yeah, it's just
they talked like there was something. Was like, when he left when he was young. When did he ever really have a relationship with Rachel for him to give up being Batman over that? There are some more logical reasons.
I mean, the fact. I mean, there's a scene where he comes out when Enterprises has his car towed. That's the problem because he has to go and get the police guy to give him a lift to Selina's house to get his car back because she stole it the night before at the party.
Or when everybody in the world knows that Bane invaded the stock exchange. Why do they go, what happened to Bruce Wayne's money?
Exactly.
Everybody in the world knows that can be reversed. At least a lot of it can be reversed.
Yeah. I've got fan fiction that does it, but hey ho.
So there are some big problems. I mean, the Dark Knight Rises was slapped together when, Heath Ledger's death killed Nolan's original idea, and he did not have, because originally that third movie was the Joker's trial was gonna be an important part of the movie. And that's why it took an extra year before he got another movie rolling off the ground. He decided to tell a different story. He's told two stories back at the beginning of Batman's career. Now let's jump to the end of it.
Yeah.
Where's the middle?
Yeah. Where's the Empire Strikes Back? What was I going to say? But with Batman and Robin, as corny as it is, as slapstick as it is, when you watch it, and I must admit, the last time I watched it, I'd just come off a binge of Adam West Batman. So I could see the parallels between what they were trying to do and the Adam West show. So I was kind of like, okay. And I don't mind George Clooney as Bruce Wayne. I think he's a decent little Bruce Wayne, but what can I say?
I would rather just rewatch Adam West than if I were in the mood for that.
Yeah.
In fact, I did rewatch the Adam West movie last week.
Right.
But this is
the angles of the rectangle are too great for us to...
taking this silliness and something that starts with what was supposed to be the Dark Knight to show the world that to prove that audiences will appreciate a more serious superhero, one that is not silly, one that is more grown up. And then over the course of 4 movies, it turns into that. This was not a series that should have gone that direction. So for people who can enjoy it, okay, you enjoy it.
Yeah, cool.
I either usually call it the Abomination or just Batman ampersand Robin.
All right, okay, cool. on that case, so we've talked about movies, we've talked about the cartoon show. What's your favorite in the comic books? What's your favorite medium for Batman? Is Batman a comic book? Is it a TV show? Is it the movies? Where do you see, I suppose, Batman coming to life the most?
Oh, you're like asking somebody, which is your favorite child?
I only have one child for that exact reason.
The comics have an advantage in that we can see things depicted that they can't do on the screen. We can see private moments. Even if they don't like doing thought balloons so much these days, they still have narrative text to tell us things about what's going on inside the hero's head that we don't get in the films. We don't get in a TV series. And so the comics have some of those advantages. And the comics have the freedom to play with any character they want. The comics, of course, this is one of the strengths of Batman the Animated Series, too. They can tell the big stories, but they can also tell the small stories. And the small stories really play to Batman's strengths. When you have the giant sprawling epic in every single movie, it's like, where are the little adventures? The ones that he solves quickly instead of him looking incompetent over the course of a couple of hours before it finally ends. Or the 30-issue, 5-title crossover story that goes on so long. There was one particular Joker story, the death of the family, in which he made everybody look incompetent. It's the Nightfall story. They structured it well. It was a big crossover too, the one in which Bane broke Batman's back, but they structured it where Batman had a lot of little victories along the way, and
little losses. And little losses.
And little losses, but then you have small stories as part of this. Because he was wearing himself out as part of his whole thing. He was
stacking, isn't it? You could call it stacking. Every issue was another.
It was very well planned, and it didn't raise. Even when he was losing, you understood why. It wasn't because he'd gotten dumber. It was because he was sick. Actually, he had a little bit of a cold or something, and he was fatigued. He was worn out, as opposed to that particular Joker story in which the Joker is outsmarting 30 different characters, and yet he still makes the dumb mistake that makes him lose in the last minute after all these issues.
It's crazy. It's a great point. It's a great point. I've often said that Batman needs to get back to solving like muggins and stuff. I can't remember the last time he stopped a simple muggin.
I know. I mean, I refer to my book about how there have been so many stories that open with him stopping a mugging, although we haven't really seen that much lately. It used to be very common. There's an alley. Batman shows up, stops a mugging.
Because it's the mirror of his own origin, right?
It is. One particular story, A Night of the Stalker. That's it's reprinted from the early 70s. Englehart wrote the text, though it was mainly the artist idea. He sees a bank robbery where parents get killed and there's an upset kid, and he hunts down each of these criminals one by one. He doesn't say a word through the whole story. That's a really powerful story. If people can track that down, I highly recommend that one. But those are the things that show a lot of his character or a lot of his strengths in a short time. And I want a smarter Batman in the movies. And honestly, the smartest one we've seen in the movies.
George Clooney.
Yeah, it's they made Val Kilmer's version more scientifically adept and better at figuring things out than Clooney's character. So they gave him some extra smarts. I'm not arguing real strong in favor of the Val Kilmer one either. Clooney looked more like Batman than any of those guys in those movies.
Yeah.
But he didn't know the voice.
No.
Keaton did the voice. Kilmer did it more subtly, but he did do the voice. And then Clooney, it's the same. It's like with Adam West. It's the same voice for Batman and Bruce Wayne.
So it does my wife's head in. We're currently rewatching Arrow, the CW show. And we're mid-season, season 1. He's just being beaten up by the Black Archer.
Oh yeah, he's not really a superhero yet.
Yeah,
that's why when they were ashamed to be making a superhero show. They had not owned. They didn't even give the city the right name.
Yeah,
they did not own the fact that they were making a superhero TV show. Bit by bit, they learned this. Okay, if we do this, we can go up a step. Now we can do this. Now we have the Flash. Oh, now we can go crazy.
Yeah, so with the way he wears his hood and he's got his just paint over his face. Mm-hmm. Every time someone sees him, my wife's like, "How did he not know it's like Oliver Queen? He's only wearing mascara, for Christ's sake." I'm like, "Oh, it's fair point. It's fair point. It's fair point." Your book is structured into chapters, into case files.
Yes.
What was the premise for this? Is it these are your favorite characters, or do you think these have the most sort of impact on Batman or Bruce Wayne?
Okay, now the chapters each has a main topic, such as a chapter on trauma, a chapter on down-to-earth criminals, a chapter on outlandish criminals, insanity, Batman's love life, and so forth. The case files that are in there, and it was actually kind of one of my sons. He made a comment that you should structure it around the criminals. It's like, well, I can't structure the whole thing around the criminals, but that led me to think of the case files. So there are these short features on the most important criminals and a couple of odd little ones who they let me bring something psychological to talk about that others, like that Mad Hatter is not one of the better known Batman villains publicly. Like we still haven't seen him in a movie, although he has been on Gotham. And King Tut for the old Adam West show.
Oh, I love King
they
Tut.
let me talk about some psychological issues that none of the others did. And a couple get left out of. There's no specific feature on Talia. There's her personality has never been well fleshed out. She's always presented in relation to somebody else, as a function of somebody else's story for the most part, whether it was her dad or her son. And that can help her be a mysterious figure. But we've never gotten to see far past the surface with her. Others, such rich characters. Well, he's the superhero is defined by his psychology, so his enemies need to be defined by their psychology too. And it's such a rich mix of characters. In the second edition, with the Harley's feature, we had I took out something, but I added quite a bit talking about gaslighting. Because 10 years ago, people weren't really using the phrase gaslighting so much, and people have been talking a lot about it now. And we've had movies that have led people to really appreciate Harley as a character on her own. We like her most when she's left the Joker,
definitely,
and as well as a couple of the others. The Scarecrow, I had some new things to say. Poison Ivy, I replaced some speculation related to her pheromonal power to talk about introversion. That's especially Ivy, a friend of mine who's a poison ivy expert. I even quote her for one paragraph in there, where she's talking about her concern that introverted Ivy, people might start overlooking her when she's hanging out with extroverted Harley, which is a very real issue for a lot of introverted people.
Interesting. Do you worry about, when you were writing the first and the second issue, do you worry about the kind of heavy, and obviously the aim is to be a psychology of Batman in his crew, in his cast, so to speak. Do you worry about the depth of how much you go into certain things? I was reading the book, and the 5 stages of grief come up in there. And do you ever worry that the psychological idea behind what you're trying to say is too much for people who want to just pick up a book about Batman?
If they just want to pick up a book about Batman, well, one, the title says Batman and psychology.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people don't realize what that means.
Exactly.
A lot will think psychology just means therapy, and it is the science of who we are, the science of why we do anything we do. So we can talk about anything. We can talk about growing up. We can talk about relationships. Not just from the unhealthy side of it. We can look at the healthy side of human nature. And yeah, of course, there would be some issues. Well, in the first edition, one of the things that's in the Scarecrow, I speculate about the neuroscience of his toxins. And for the second edition, I cut that down quite a bit because I did pick up some people felt like I'd left psychology. No, that is in psychology, but still, that's not as personal to the Scarecrow. And likewise, some of the stuff with Ivy's power. So, but it's like what fits the story of Batman, not just any random psychology topic. What fits this character? What can I say about this character that's interesting and meaningful to people? And it's like, well, trauma, PTSD. People have heard about it so many times and have so many misconceptions about it. They know Batman. And I can use Batman to talk about which symptoms of PTSD does he have, which ones does he not have, as usually written. Well, and that lets people have a different look at Batman, which is what they came to that book for. But it also sneaks up a different look at PTSD on him.
Brilliant.
And that's why it's Batman and psychology rather than just psychology of Batman. Each is a focus to talk about the other.
Cool, excellent. It's interesting when we talk about PTSD. I used to, in my day job, I used to work for a company, a mental health care company provider, and PTSD was bandied around. I'm not an expert in any shape, way, or form, but PTSD can be an emotional trauma. It doesn't have to be a physical trauma. When you hear PTSD, you automatically think of soldiers or cops getting shot or getting injured, but PTSD can be like an emotional loss. It could be the death of a parent.
People tend to think about some of the more extreme examples like those with that phrase, and it is a very broad term. One person's PTSD can have a different mix of symptoms. Oh yeah, that link right there is not the right one from my books, by the way.
I apologize. Let us get rid of that straight away. Okay.
I wish I'd cut that out. People look at that's not right. I just checked it. It's like that doesn't lead to me. Okay, PTSD. The one person's PTSD is going to be different from somebody else. One person can have these symptoms, and this person have those symptoms where they do have something in common for it to be the same disorder, but it can be manifest so differently in these different people, or which ones are the most. Whereas one person, the most extreme symptom may be how they avoid anything that at all reminds them of it. Somebody else might not have that particular avoidance symptom. There's a phenomenon called post-traumatic growth, which has been surprising to me how many people have told me they had never heard of post-traumatic growth before they read Batman in psychology.
So explain that to us then, because it's a new term that I'm not
people who've gone through severe trauma, they may have had PTSD. They have some symptoms, especially re-experiencing it. But whatever they've gone through, whatever degree of it, it's that they've taken their pain, they've taken this traumatic experience, and they've used it to grow. Examples, Candace Lightner, whose daughter got killed by a drunk driver, was so appalled by the light sentence he got. She made her version of the Batman vow to wage war on drunk driving and founded MAD, what was originally called Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. Elie Wiesel, whose family got killed in the Holocaust, and for 10 years he couldn't even talk about what had gone on because he'd been in those camps himself as a teenager. And but he began to write about it, educate the world. In fact, our use of that word, I didn't say which of history's Holocaust I was talking about. He knew which one I meant. He's the one who popularized that word for it. And he also said it was still too weak a word. So these individuals, they went through horrible things in their lives. And these are very extreme examples too. A person does not have to go through that level of trauma to be changed by it, to whether they're being crushed by it or they hang on to it and grow. These people, one example of something they have in common with PTSD is they relive it more than most people. Most people overcome within what we qualify for a mental disorder, most people overcome their trauma. They may never let it go, but it's in terms of qualifying for a mental illness, most will not, or at least not in the long run. But the people who have post-traumatic growth, they hold on to it. They feel like it would be selfish to let it go.
Interesting. So there's a link and also a separation of the two. Interesting. Right, we're going to take a quick break before we come back with some more questions for Dr. Travis Langley about Batman, the psychology of Batman, and the Dark Stormy Night. We've talked about comics, so shall we? Which one of our fantastic ads shall we have? I tell you what, why don't you check out this ad for one of my favorite shows, The Old Timers.
Do you want to find out what makes the professor do his happy dance? Check out the Old Timers Comic Book Show, only on the UCPN.
There you go, the professor doing his little happy dance. That's right, the Old Timers Comic Book Show, where the hosts aren't old, but the comics most certainly are. All right, stay tuned for a new episode of that in a couple of weeks. It's one of our Tainted Love specials for Valentine's Day. There you go. Excellent. So we're back with Dr. Travis Langley. Doctor, there's something I've seen on Twitter. I saw it a little while ago, and it postulated the theory that in Winnie the Pooh, the characters of 100 Acre Wood are all examples of Christopher Robin's mindset. So, for example, Tigger is the hyperactive one, the ADHD one.
Eeyore's depression.
Yeah, exactly. Piglet's the introverted one. You know, Pooh's got an eating disorder. So, my question, therefore, is: do you think the villains of Batman have the same sort of relationship to him as the Winnie the Pooh characters have to Christopher Robin's? And if so,
it seems like a weird way to put it, but basically, yeah. Although Batman's, I think, is a bit more complex. But okay. I think the ones, it may not have been what they planned. As this is going to reflect this aspect of his personality. But the ones they came up with, once upon a time, and just one villain at a time. Because originally he's fighting gangsters, mad scientists, and bit by bit they added the villains that we think of. They reflect and distort aspects of Batman himself. So the Joker obviously is an arch nemesis, the grim brooding hero who dresses like a monster. His ultimate enemy is the bright laughing monster that looks like a clown. The Penguin, he's dressed for high society. He actually reflects the distort aspects of Bruce Wayne. Two-Face, well, he's monster down one side and Bruce Wayne looking guy down the other. And on through, the Riddler challenges him intellectually. And that's why I think the Riddler, although it's a Zodiac-based version of the Riddler, I think he's a very good one for this film in which they're trying to make Batman more of a detective than he has been in any previous movie. And so each of and then Catwoman, designed to be a different animal-based character, the Cat and the Bat. The ones that endure, the ones they come up with that don't stick around are the ones that don't fit into that way. You come up with, the Cavalier, he's a guy who swings a sword.
The Condiment King.
Yeah, it doesn't naturally relate to Batman himself. He could have been inserted into anybody's story. He'd make so much more sense in Green Arrow's story.
Yeah. Totally get that.
And so he wasn't going to be one that you would see a lot of. Captain Stingery, pirate themed guy.
The dude with the 10 eyes for his fingers. Well, I have no idea what he's called anymore, but hey ho. So it's just an interesting thought to think that these characters, I mean, I agree with you. The Joker is the chaos to Batman's order. You know, Two-Face is a more visual representation of the schism between Bruce Wayne and Batman. You know, Catwoman's the foil that he can never truly have because she's on the wrong side of the law, kind of, you know, and so on. Bane challenges him physically.
Yeah, Bane was very specifically created. And Bane is very smart. The comic book version of Bane is a very smart character, too.
What do you think about, I mean, I always say that Killer Croc in the comics was kind of like a proto Bane, because the Killer Croc, when Jason Tuts.
Croc originally is just this gangster with, you know, alligator hide skin, who bit by bit became more of a monster, and somewhere along the way he was a bit more Bane-like. But Croc kept getting more monstrous and dumber as he went along.
Yeah.
And Bane was very specifically, I mean, I've had conversations with Denny O'Neil about this too. Bane was very specifically created to be, for Batman, what Doomsday had been for Superman. They just had the death of Superman, and Doomsday was about giving him somebody who could give him a really long fight. And when you create a new enemy for Superman, you start with what challenges his powers. With Batman, you got to come up with something more complex, because he's not defined by powers in that way. And so Bane, even the name Bane reflects that they created him to be Batman's Bane.
Very good. Excellent. So who's your favorite Bat villain? Yeah, I'm asking you to pick, kids, again. Sorry.
Your favorite villain in the comics, it's hard for somebody to write a good story. But the ones who can write the really good, I love a good Riddler story.
Okay.
And it takes a bit more for the writers come up with a good one that's not just, there are those that are overly silly. There are those where, it's just all death traps. But there are those where you get really interesting characterizations. I enjoyed the Riddler in the early 2000s, before the New 52, when he was this narcissistic detective and appearing in the Gotham City Sirens, appearing in other people's stories. And it was very interesting interactions that he brought out with everybody.
I recently watched Hush, the animated movie, and of course I've got Hush in trade and comic book form as well. I was talking to guys down at my local comic book store, and I said, I really like the twist that it's the Riddler that's behind it all. Spoilers.
from how long ago? Spoiler from 20 years ago?
Yeah, just checking. But then the guy says, well, actually, did you not know that the Riddler was always supposed to be the bad guy? But when they started Hush, loads of readers worked out straight away. That's why they had to pigeonhole the death of Tommy Elliott in there, and why it gets a little bit convoluted. They had to bring Harold back in. And, you know, unless you're a mad keen Batman fan, you have no idea who Harold is.
Yeah,
right?
I guess so, yeah.
And you're like, because what's he going on there? But, you know.
I liked Harold.
I liked Harold. I thought, you know.
Wasn't he originally the Penguin's flunky the first time
he was back in Detective Comics by Alan Grant and Norm Brayfogle.
That's right.
Somewhere around, taking a guess. Well, I'm not taking a guess. I know it's around the 615s, I think. Yeah. Something like that. 615, 68, 618, something around there. Obviously, you've said 10 years, Batman's changed, we've changed, the audience has changed, the audience perceptions and what they want, expectation-wise, has changed.
That's even why one of the new chapters is kind of about the audience itself. Normally, I don't do that.
Okay.
I talked about there's a fandom chapter in my Supernatural book, but usually I don't get into analyzing the fans. I'll have some comments here and there, but I've got one of the new chapters is about Batman as inspiration. Now, the first half of that is about Batman inspiring other people in his world. So let me talk a bit more about Cassandra Cain and the Signal and some others who didn't really fit like the Robin's chapter. But the last half of the chapter is how he inspires people in our world.
All right. I was going to say, you can't say Cassandra Cain and not include Stephanie Brown. I am on
Stephanie Brown is in my Robin's chapter.
Yes, at last she gets recognition. Yes, come on.
Once in a while, at an audience question, somebody will ask, "Who's your favorite Robin?" And I usually throw them all off when I say Stephanie Brown. I don't care if she was only Robin for 3 months. I love the character Stephanie Brown.
You and me
really do. Adolescent rebellion as her reason for becoming a superhero is different and wonderful. I love Stephanie Brown. So Stephanie already had a good representation in the book, and I didn't really have anything to say about Cassandra Cain when I did the first edition, and that's always bugged me, and I knew it bugged a couple of readers too. So if that's why she's one of the and Duke, you know, the Signal, or some of the people I talked about in the first half of that inspiration chapter, but the latter part about how he inspires people in the real world. Why people, how in the world can anybody be inspired by a fictional character? For some, it's just that like the Batman symbol will help them maintain a marathon. Have you ever seen the documentary Legends of the Night?
Yes, years
Yes.
ago.
Yeah, and I've got 5 minutes in the middle of it. But I feel out of place. I'm there among people like a young woman, Jill Pentozzi, with muscular dystrophy. And Batman inspired her when she finally reached the point, instead of wishing every night to wake up with superpowers and knew that was not going to happen. It's like, well, you know what? Batman makes it happen, and he doesn't have superpowers. Someone like that is inspired by Batman. And then there are the people who they find inspiration to avoid suicide. Well, a number of different fictional characters for different people, but I've heard from a number who it was Batman. Paul Dini, who created Harley and wrote for Batman the Animated Series. He had a brutal mugging years ago. He's written a graphic novel about it, and he was like, "How can I write about a heroic character when nobody stepped up to save me?" But he got to having mental conversations with superheroes. And with Batman, it was like Batman became his drill sergeant, telling him to get off his butt, don't drink that alcohol. And he's like, go do something. And different people in different ways. Abraham Reisman was a writer who he had found inspiration. There was a comment Alfred made in one of the movies about endure.
Yeah.
That and he didn't. Abraham would say this like a mantra to himself to help him when he's written publicly about when he'd been in a very dark state. But then it was Paul Dini's graphic novel that helped him understand why that line from this fictional character resonated with him so strongly.
It's interesting you bring up Alfred, because I've on my scratch sheet, I've put Alfred. I was put a circle around it saying I must talk about Alfred.
Alfred, who got killed, and yet he keeps showing up in stories because we'll just set it while he was alive, because we know we need Alfred in stories.
I was going to say, I mean, you've got to do well to. I mean, they've done him in, and the current story, the current modern day version, continuity wise, Bruce is a little bit less rich. He has no Alfred. He's got no Jim Gordon anymore, because he's been Batman Who Laughed, who just looks like Judge Death. Sorry, it is Judge Death.
And his not being rich is for reasons almost as dumb as happened in The Dark Knight Rises.
Yeah, pretty much. So Alfred's been the father figure for Bruce for years and years and years. I'm not going to ask the obvious question, how important is it? But as a fan, how do you feel that there's no Alfred who, in the current continuity? Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. The dudes keep going back and telling stories back when young Bruce and all that sort of stuff. But
repeatedly, or no, even recently, like I was mentioning that Batman Urban Legends series that I've been reading, and there's several stories in there. And it's like they're set currently, but there's Alfred. It's like, it takes place whenever it takes place. The Wayne family web comics, webtoons. I love those. Those are they're hilarious and some good character studies. Of course, Alfred's in there with that family, but he has this. I do think interesting stories can be told. It's like, okay, what if we take these things away from him? What is he like before The Dark Knight Rises? When somebody would say, "Oh, Batman's," you take away his toys. No, before The Dark Knight Rises, I said you could take away his costume, his money, his toys, and drop him in the middle of nowhere, and he's still Batman. And The Dark Knight Rises did that clumsily, but they're still making the point that you take all those things away from him, or at least kinda, and he's still Batman.
Can I respectfully kind of disagree a little bit on that?
Go right ahead.
I say in my head, in The Dark Knight Rises, when he crawls out of the pit eventually, it's not Batman that crawls out, it's Bruce Wayne. And the movie therefore should be called Bruce Wayne Rises.
Well, in the Nolan movies, he's, especially the first and last one, he's mainly Bruce Wayne.
Yeah, and I think that's the juxtaposition between the change of pace, because he's trying to be he's trying to be Batman in The Dark Knight Rises, and it just, we talked about how my feelings on it. For me, The Dark Knight Rises should end. It should be like that Twilight movie where there's two parts, or the Harry Potter one. It should be like part one, he gets beaten, he gets thrown in the pit, the end. Yeah, you know, like The Empire Strikes Back ends with Han Solo frozen. That's it, the end. All right?
In Star Wars without Han still frozen.
All right, and then fair enough. The next part starts with how he comes back. That's how it should be. And that way you don't get clumsy fan service getting pushed in, you know? And then you watch Batman, you watch Dark Knight Rises, and he hardly does anything but fly around in that bloody plane. He's like Iron Man in the first Avengers movie, does nothing but fly around. It's like grrr, and annoy Captain America. But, you know, hey ho. So, Alfred.
Yes.
Do you miss Alfred?
Haven't gone long enough without Alfred stories to have time to miss him. Really haven't. They keep showing up. I was reading one last night that it's a recent comic, and there's Alfred in the story again. So I think if those are good stories, there's an important place in those stories. But if they're really wanting to, let's play out the story of Batman with Alfred, they need to commit themselves a little more. Let's tell that story. Let's really see that weight on him and what is missing in his life before Alfred comes, gets turned into the outsider again, or whatever way they bring him back eventually. On their next, multiverse reboot.
Oh, don't get me started on those. What I will say is that Bruce Wayne being less rich reminds me of when they do like prequel Star Trek series where the ship can only go warp 4 instead of warp 8. It has no impact whatsoever. It doesn't matter. The whole universe is still the universe. But there you go. All right. Okay. So I guess my last question for tonight, if that's okay, is one of the big questions when you think about Batman. Who's the mask? Is Batman the mask, or is Bruce Wayne the mask?
Yes.
I suppose this is my own fault for asking a closed question.
Which is the mask? He has the Batman mask, and he has a Bruce Wayne mask. And it's like, yes, the bored playboy, careless guy. That's definitely not where his heart is at. His heart is in the Batman mission. But when he's the urban legend, when he is the extra scary Batman who can't show that he's hurt, well, that's not really him either. That is also an act. And very, very much his purpose is in the Batman, and he thinks of himself as Batman. But there is a Batman act. There is a Batman mask, and there is a Bruce Wayne mask, as Rachel says at the end of Batman Begins. And different writers take different perspectives on it. Some take the view that, well, he's really Batman. And some, like Paul Levitz, will take the view that no, he's Bruce Wayne. After all, it wasn't Bat's parents who got killed in that alley. Christopher Nolan took kind of the 3-part view that I take, that there's a Batman act and there's a Bruce Wayne act, but then there's the guy that he really is. And the main place you see that is when it's just him and Alfred. It's what I'll sometimes refer to as Batcave Bruce, when he's down in the cave with the mask back, sitting there with a cup of coffee, and he's talking to Alfred and maybe one of the kids. Kevin Conroy's view is that he's really himself when he's alone. Yeah. Now, Kevin and I talked about this, and he's like, but then you don't really get to see anything. Okay, yeah, he's alone. Well, unless you're giving us a lot of thought bubbles, nothing's happening for us to see that.
Yeah. I suppose the Batman Beyond cartoon probably fuels part of that idea, because Old Man Bruce is there, isn't he?
And he's Old Man Bruce. This is Bruce Wayne having lost a bit of his faith. It is him taking a slightly darker path, not the darkest path he could take, but he's isolated himself. He's felt like a failure, and Terry McGinnis shows up, and Bruce vicariously kind of lives through them. He still thinks of himself as Batman. We know from that. It's like, the voice in my head was calling me Bruce.
I love that episode.
It's like, then what do you? That's my name now. It's like, tell that to my subconscious.
Yeah, I love that bit. That was, that's is it Scream they call him, the guy, but the little speakers behind you say his class. Very good episode. Very good episode. I think Batman Beyond is totally underrated.
It's not unknown enough, and I have to think through. Did he say this publicly? Okay, like Michael Uslan, executive producer of the movies, he tried to get Warner Brothers to make a live-action Batman Beyond a long time ago. They didn't feel there was enough potential for sequels and franchise from it, so they didn't do it. Michael has kept bringing it up because he would really, although it used to be years ago, Michael wanted Clint Eastwood for old Batman. But then you go along far enough, and he's like, oh, he wants Michael Keaton to be old Batman. Of course, now Michael Keaton is old Batman.
Yeah. Very good. In the new Flashpoint movie. Excellent. All right. Dr. Langley, thank you so much for spending time talking to me about one of my favorite characters, Stephanie Brown. I mean, Batman.
Oh, thank you. I've enjoyed this, and you've managed to come up with a bunch of stuff I don't get asked over and over in these interviews.
Go on. So, for everything that's UCPN related, don't forget to check out the Old Timers Comic Book Show, TDC, the Definitive Crusade, for all your DC comic news. And of course, it's sister show, No Prize Podcast, for all you Marvel heads and your MCU and your Disney Plus. Dr. Langley, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. The book is great. I absolutely love reading it. I'm halfway through, so no spoilers, please. And that's it for the show. I have been your host, as always, Johnny Machine Hughes. Adios.
Bye.
Visit undercovercapes.com for the latest and greatest podcasts via the Undercover Capes Podcast Network. Also visit our parent company website, comiccrusaders.shop, all about comic pop culture.